Have you ever wondered what it was really like to live in the Middle Ages? Forget the fairy tale castles and damsels in distress for a moment. The reality was a complex, often brutal, but utterly fascinating system that shaped the world we live in today. This was the age of feudalism, a pyramid of power built on land, loyalty, and service. So, how did this intricate system come to be, and what led to its eventual downfall? Let's journey back in time and uncover the rise and fall of the medieval world order. Our story begins with the collapse of a giant, the Roman Empire. By the 5th century, the once mighty empire was crumbling. Legions retreated, trade routes withered, and a power vacuum was left across Europe. Imagine a world without a central government, without police, without a unified army. It was a time of chaos. Vikings raided from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens from the south. People were terrified, and they desperately needed protection. This is where feudalism took root. It wasn't a grand plan designed by some genius. It was a practical, almost organic response to a crisis. Local strongmen, or lords who had land and could afford to raise a small army of knights, offered protection to the common people. In return for safety, these people, known as peasants or serfs, would work the lord's land. This basic exchange protection for labor was the bedrock of the entire feudal system. At the very top of this pyramid was the king. In theory, the king owned all the land in the kingdom. But in practice, he couldn't manage it all himself. So, he granted large chunks of land, called fiefs, to his most trusted nobles, the dukes and earls. These powerful lords became his vassals. In exchange for the land, they pledged their loyalty and, crucially, military service. This meant that when the king needed to go to war, he would call upon his nobles, and they were obligated to show up with their knights. This process then cascaded down the pyramid. The high-ranking nobles would subdivide their own land and grant it to lesser lords or barons. These barons, in turn, became vassals to the dukes and earls, promising their own loyalty and military support. And these lesser lords might even grant smaller parcels of land to individual knights. It was a complex web of personal allegiances. Your loyalty wasn't to a country or a flag, but to the lord directly above you. This oath of fealty, a solemn promise of loyalty, was the glue that held the whole system together. Life revolved around the manor, which was the lord's estate. A manor was a self-sufficient world. It had the lord's castle or manor house, a village for the peasants, a church, farmland, pastures, and forests. The lord was the law of the land. He acted as the judge, the tax collector, and the military commander of his domain. He held court, settled disputes, and gave permission for his serfs to marry. And what about the vast majority of the population, the serfs? Their lives were tough. They weren't exactly slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold, but they weren't free either. They were tied to the land. They couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. They spent their days toiling in the fields, planting and harvesting crops. A portion of everything they produced went to the lord. They also had to work on the lord's personal lands, called the domain, for a set number of days each week. On top of that, they paid taxes for using the lord's mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their bread. Life was a cycle of hard labor, dictated by the seasons, but don't think it was all grim. The medieval calendar was filled with religious festivals and feast days, which provided a welcome break from the daily grind. The village church was the center of social life, and faith provided comfort and a sense of community in a harsh world. And let's not forget the knights, the iconic figures of the Middle Ages. They were the warrior class, the armored tanks of the medieval battlefield. Being a knight was expensive. You needed a war horse, armor, and weapons, which cost a fortune. This is why land was so important. It provided the wealth needed to support a knight. They trained from a young age, first as a page, then as a squire, learning the arts of war and the code of chivalry. For several centuries, this system, for all its flaws, provided a degree of stability. It allowed Europe to slowly recover from the chaos that followed Rome's fall. Manors produced food, knights provided defense, and a hierarchical society kept everyone in their place. But things were about to change. The seeds of feudalism's decline were sown at the height of its power. One of the first major cracks appeared with the Crusades, starting in the late 11th century. Thousands of lords and knights left their manors to fight in the Holy Land. To finance these epic journeys, many sold their lands or allowed their serfs to buy their freedom. The Crusades also reopened trade routes with the East, bringing back new goods, ideas, and, most importantly, a renewed flow of money. This resurgence of trade led to the rebirth of towns and cities. Merchants and artisans, the people who made and sold goods, began to gather in urban centers. A new class emerged, the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. Unlike the nobles, their power wasn't based on land, but on wealth and commerce. They weren't part of the traditional feudal pyramid. Kings soon realized that they could tax these wealthy towns and use the money to hire their own armies of professional soldiers called mercenaries. This made the king less dependent on his nobles and their knights. Why beg a reluctant duke for soldiers when you can just pay for a loyal army yourself? Then, in the mid-14th century, disaster struck. The Black Death. This horrific plague swept across Europe, wiping out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. The demographic collapse was catastrophic, but it had a profound and unexpected impact on the feudal system. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage. The serfs who survived were in a much stronger bargaining position. Lords were desperate for workers to farm their land. Serfs could demand better conditions, higher wages, or their freedom. Many simply abandoned their old manors and fled to towns or other estates that offered them a better deal. The old bonds that tied serfs to the land were shattered. Peasant revolts also erupted across Europe. Fueled by new expectations and resentment against taxes and feudal obligations, peasants rose up against their lords. Though often brutally suppressed, these uprisings signaled that the old order was no longer accepted without question. The deference and obligation that underpinned feudalism were eroding. Technological changes on the battlefield also played a part. The introduction of the longbow and, later, gunpowder weapons like cannons changed the nature of warfare. A trained archer with a longbow could take down an expensive, heavily armored knight from a distance. Cannons could smash down the stone walls of castles that had been impenetrable for centuries. The military dominance of the knight and the security of the castle, two pillars of feudal power, were crumbling. By the end of the 15th century, the world looked very different. Feudalism hadn't vanished overnight, but it was a shadow of its former self. Strong, centralized monarchies were on the rise in places like England, France, and Spain. National identity was beginning to replace personal loyalty to a local lord. A money-based economy was replacing the land-based system. The intricate pyramid of feudalism had been shaken by plague, transformed by commerce, and battered by new technologies. It gave way to a new era, paving the path for the Renaissance and the modern nations we know today. The medieval world order had fallen, but its legacy, etched in our laws, languages, and landscapes, endures. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey back in time interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to explore next. See you in the next video.